All right. Hello, everybody. Dr. Danielle. Hey,
Yes.
Jen.
Hey, girl.
Hola.
Oh, I love it. So here we are meeting on a good old Zoom meeting, everybody. Nothing fancy today.
Hi, I'm Dave.
Hey, how's it going?
Good.
Okay, so I made the mistake of making there a waiting room. So I am needing to let people in. So I'm going to try to do two things at once here. So first of all, thank you all for showing up for this. Our team, a few of us are here right now and some are popping in. We've been working on this for many years. I would say the inception of it really started in 2016, but we started recording around 2019. And now we are at a point where we're able to show a significant portion of it to you. And it was one of those rare projects for me, at least, where I don't know if you can relate to this, but often I will start something and then my interest in it kind of peters out as the years go on. With this, it was great. Like every person that we met, every new iteration of what post-traumatic growth might mean or could mean or didn't mean just added to the amount of excitement that I had for putting this project together. So this is a little bit of a funky time in the day to meet. So we have quite a few people that are going to be getting this recording. So it's going to be us. And how this is going to work is in a moment, I'm going to have some of the panelists introduce themselves. And Paris Robinson was supposed to be here, but he actually had a death in the family just last night. So he sends his love and we can all send him our love too in the form of thoughts and prayers. So why don't we start off with quick intros and then we will get right into the film. Dr. Danielle, why don't we start with you?
Hi, everybody. I'm Danielle. I am a clinically trained doctor of physical therapy, switched careers and pivoted. And I got my master's in depth psychology with an emphasis in Jungian and archetypal studies. I am moving into my doctoral portion of that, writing a dissertation. But on the daily, I am a somatic experiencing practitioner. So I'm helping really build a bridge between the physiological aspects of trauma and the psychological aspects of trauma and helping people navigate that psychosomatically. So thanks, Jess.
Great. Thanks, Danielle. Rick Alexander, who is our writer. Go ahead, Rick.
Hey, great to see everybody. Yeah, so I'm the writer for the doc, and I work as a writer, a speaker, and also a coach, working with a lot of this content, and working with people that have gone through trauma. And it's interesting because as a writer, what I got out of the military, I spent 12 years in the military as special operations combat medic. And when I got out, I had this deep desire to write about the human experience. My second book, the subtitle was a book about what it means to be human. And interestingly enough, I think I've really deepened in my understanding of what it means to be human, which is that we live in a traumatic and fracturing world. And we'll get into that. But part of, I think, what drives me is really wanting to turn and face that aspect of human existence. I think that's what we're all doing here. And I think there's a part of me that feels compelled by that to share and to write and to try to articulate that aspect of the human experience. Yeah. So writer, speaker, coach. Jess, you're muted.
Wow, I haven't done that in a while. Dr. Mike, you're up.
I'm Dr. Mike Nelson. I have a PhD in exercise physiology and metabolism. Before that, I did a master's in biomechanics, mechanical engineering. And right now I work as an associate professor at the Carrick Institute, and they do a lot of clinical neuroscience. And then I have my own business, which is Extreme Human Performance, where I do work with coaching some people online and still do some research, do some assessments for the guys over at Rapid Health, teach part-time for Rocky Mountain University, and yeah, just super honored to be here and to be a part of this. And thank you all for all your work.
Thank you, Mike. All right, we have John. John from Canada.
Hi, Jonathan Archambault. That's the best English way of saying my last name. I'm a writer as well. I'm a coach. I'm a veteran, ex-first responder who went through the trauma itself. And yeah, and still in recovery and doing my best to break the stigma around it. That's pretty much it.
Thank you. All right, now we have Jen McMaster.
Hey everybody, I'm Jen McMaster. I am trying to make sense of this human experience, and along that path, I have studied kinesiology. I have studied holistic behavior change, and I have a master's in holistic organizational change management. And I love being part of this team to help on that journey of maximizing life and really feeling alive through it all, whether that's the joy and the bliss or the sadness, the grief and the sorrow.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jen. Now we have Jeff DePotzi.
Hello, folks. I'm Jeffrey David DePotzi. I'm a former Tier 1 Special Forces sniper with a unit called Joint Task Force 2. I wrestled with PTSD for a little bit and won. Especially once I discovered the paradigm shifting concept of post-traumatic growth. I now run events that intentionally facilitate post-traumatic growth, and I'm a co-producer of Dark Night of Our Soul. Thanks, Jess.
Sweet. Thank you, Jeff. Then we have our director, Luke Montgomery.
Unmute. Hi, guys. I'm a storyteller, filmmaker, writer. And I've been gratefully been on this project from, around the beginning in 2019 with everyone. I've always sort of navigated my next project and story sort of intuitively, what's drawing me to that, my personal interests. And this one just felt like so much more than that. And like Jess said, it's a lot of work and a lot of time, but it just felt like fateful and just so blessed to be on this project. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Luke. Dr. Trung.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Trung Ngo. My background training is as a chiropractor, but for about a decade, I was the associate director of the Mount Sinai Hospital Function and Pain Program in Toronto. And I got to work alongside or lead actually a group of medical, psychological, occupational, and physical clinicians in treating people with complex chronic pain. And a big part of that is that people who have trauma, they go on to have complex chronic pain. That was an experience that allowed me to see how siloed the healthcare system really is and how we need to expand our understanding of each other's work in order to understand the person as a whole. I'm also a resilience researcher. And the questions that as a resilience researcher we ask are, why do some people not have chronic pain? Or if they do have chronic pain, how do they recover faster? And right now, I'm focusing on how to provide care to those people who are marginalized or vulnerable in order for them to get proper treatment. So my research now is with the homeless people in the city of Mississauga to see what are the barriers for them to seek care, and why do some homeless people not want to be in homes? So it's really interesting that I was asked to be a part of this, and I've learned so much as a person, even though I have a lot of experience personally and professionally. There's been some great people as part of this program, and happy to be part of this, and very, very honored. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, who do we have left? Who am I missing? Is that everybody? Okay, great. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to send you a link in the chat box to watch the film on your own. And the reason why we're doing that is if we were to stream it through Zoom, there's Wi-Fi issues, lag issues, all of those things. So you're going to watch it natively. And so what you can do is just minimize Zoom, put yourself on mute, and then we will come back in 37 minutes, which will somebody do the math for me on that? I can't do math on the fly, nor really if I had time to do it either. What would that be?
48 minutes. Oh, 2:48.
2:48. Okay, we'll be back at 2:48, which is what time zone?
Eastern.
Eastern. Okay, perfect. All right, so we will see you soon. And here is the link. And thank you so much for watching this, everybody. This is exciting for us. All right, we'll see you at 2:47 Eastern. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. All right. Thank you so much for watching that with us. So now we're going to begin the panel. And if you have any questions that come up, please feel free to put them into the chat box. And if we have any time at the end, we're going to answer those. And if not, I will direct them to the right person and you'll get an email. The next thing is that this isn't quite the right container to talk too many specifics about something that's happening in your personal life or personal situation. So if it seems like it's a question like that, go ahead and email me. I'll pop my email into the chat box in a moment here, and then we can take it from there. And after all of this, I'm going to be sending all of you a survey to get your unfiltered feedback on how you felt about the film and other things like the flow, given that it is the short 30-minute version of what will be a 90-minute feature. But we'd love to get your feedback because as we go into this next round of post-production, it's really helpful to get that kind of feedback from you. All right, so I'd like to pose the first question to Rick, and anyone can jump in that's on the panel to talk to this afterwards. But Rick, I was wondering if you could start with, why did we make this film? Like, what is the whole point of doing all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I could write a book about it or even a documentary. You know, it's interesting because I think in trying to answer the why question, it also points at what a monumental task it is. And I don't want that to, I want us to stay conscious of what a task we're like embarking, not only us as a team building this documentary and trying to put these ideas out in the world, but if something in this documentary resonated with you, there's also a monumental task to walk what resonated with you into life. And part of the reason is because we're not just trying to offer new ideas, but we're trying to offer new ways about thinking about the whole thing, the way we're framing the problem. You know, some people mentioned, I've already heard it actually today, we talked about the stigma of mental health. Like that's one layer of the problem, of course. But when you get through that layer, then you find that there's another problem, which is the whole way that we're thinking about it, right? So whatever we think the end goal is here is going to determine how we go about trying to get there. And so the medical model has ideas about what the end goal should be for you. And, you know, every single one of us has a personal why and why we're part of this project. And I'm sure you do and why you showed up today. But I got out of the military with a PTSD diagnosis. And it's interesting because the options that were available to me did not feel like a full life. It felt like something along the lines of numbing me enough so that I didn't have a problem with what I had been through or something along those lines. And I know that's not everybody's experience, but what I think we're trying to do, why this is so important is I saw it with myself because in getting that diagnosis, it sent me on my own adventure of trying to work with these things. And I see it with my clients every day is that if we can start to build new ways about thinking about it, about what could be possible, because we're not offering a new goal here, a new goal as you go through trauma. It's like, oh, if you go through trauma, you want to get here. What we're doing is we're offering new questions. What is possible when we go through this human experience? And even more than offering possibilities, we're starting somewhere new, which is Anderson taught at the very beginning of the documentary. He says, tragedy is built into the skeleton of life. So that's where we're starting, right? We're not starting with a fantasy that we're going to get beyond tragedy, that we're going to get beyond difficult things happening. And I think that although that fantasy is somewhat unconscious, we don't necessarily put it that way. I think that's what we're seeking to do. And then when we do go through something bad, we're only framing it in terms of getting out of it and getting to the next thing where something bad isn't happening. And what we're saying is that the bad things, the difficult things, the fracturing things, the traumatic things, that is a part of what it means to be human. And because that's the case, how can we frame our conversation? How can we add new language and new ideas about what it means to be in the midst of an experience at which that is the case? So I think part of why this is so important, I've been saying something along the lines of, I just want to have a better conversation about trauma. But what I really mean is I want to have a wider conversation. I want I want to open up possibility. You know, the way we think about things, the words we use are going to determine what's possible. Like, as an example, I wrote about this a little bit in my last book, but like, I love my shoes, this documentary, and my wife, all with the same word, right? So there's not much nuance in there. But if you study Greek culture, for example, there's 7 different flavors of love, and some would say like up to 9. And so what happens when you start to add a new vocabulary is you start to rescue more nuance in the idea. And I think that's what we're doing here. I think what we're trying to do is create new vocabulary, or not create new vocabulary, but widen our vocabulary, widen our ideas about what we're working with, so that when the inevitable does happen, when tragedy does happen, we're not stuck with the same old ideas we've been given about trying to get back to a place where that just didn't happen. I think what we're trying to do is create more nuance, and in doing so, we add possibility to going through the experience. Also, just appreciate you guys letting me like kind of ramble through this a little bit, because I think I'm still trying to articulate it cleanly myself.
Thank you, Rick. Yeah, if I can echo that sentiment, it is something that is very exploratory. And that's why we set out to create this documentary. We created it in a way where you're not supposed to do it in this way. We ended up with hundreds and hundreds of hours of unused footage because we came into it with a question: is growth after trauma something that just happens to people, or can it be available for everyone? And so through that, like Rick was saying, we discovered what we discovered. And so as we finish this film, we hope to bring a little bit more resolution to something that's very hard to define. Dr. No, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, like I love how Rick just said that in the medical model, because I think that trauma is under the purview of healthcare. And especially in North America, healthcare pathologizes everything. That constricts us, and it makes us look at trauma very, very linearly. So for example, we imagine that a person is like a piggy bank, and trauma is something that's negative. The threat of injury, the threat of death, assault, neglect, you name it. And then what that does is it shatters the piggy bank, and then we're left having to put the piggy bank together again. And that forever defines who we are as a person. But in reality, that's not actually what happens. A lot of people who have trauma don't go on to have psychological or occupational or personal dysfunction. Instead, what the resilience research is showing is that we need to look at ourselves, instead of a singular piggy bank, as more of an investment portfolio. And instead of something trauma as something bad that's happening, that a dip in any one of our investments is natural. It is a part of life. However, I'm not defined by one thing. I am a father. I am a clinician. I am a researcher. I play sports. I'm part of different communities. I'm part of spiritual sort of beliefs. So all of these things are different investments or accounts. Now, if we take a look at things that way, then we no longer see that any one event can shatter us. As a matter of fact, people who are able to grow from trauma pull on all of these other things to repair or else to sort of mitigate the losses of that one investment. And when we think of people as diverse, as more than one point in space, as more than one thing, then it opens up to the questions of how do we build capacity for people by increasing their literacy about trauma, by increasing their understanding that they are not one thing. If we can do that, then we can sort of mitigate the effects of any one event on a person's life. And we could, if we think of it that way, this way, then we can also think of how do we use multiple parts of their lives to help them, their resources to help them. And how do we use the losses not as things that shatter us, but things as lessons and how to invest in the future.
Beautiful. Thank you. Anyone else want to add to that? Go ahead and just unmute yourself. And if not,
I'll speak up there. I think what Dr. No said was really, really beautiful. And I feel like, at least in my work with somatics, a really huge component of that process is taking someone's consciousness that has gotten stuck in a vortex of negative, overwhelming experience and opening to something different. It's not forcing them to be different, but just presenting or allowing a revealing of something, whether that's different or just a different shade of the same thing that they're going through, to allow their consciousness to rock a little bit rather than staying stuck in this habitual pattern that's cycling around an axis of survival. And so it allows the consciousness to move. And from my perspective, it seems as if we take a perspective that there's not necessarily anything wrong with where consciousness is at, but just opening to something else, I feel as if the body and psyche know how to navigate that if we can hold that container adequately. And something that was presented in the short here was just this beautiful statement about needing practitioners, support systems, individuals that aren't pathologizing where people are as a result of traumatic experience. And if there are just a few people putting ripples out of the okayness and the opening, I think that does a lot to consciousness. That's all I have to say.
thanks, Dr. D. Yeah, one of the more challenging things that we've experienced in this exploration and the creation of the documentary was, what is trauma even, right? Like, that word holds so much weight to it. And to tell everyone, or to, I guess, nudge the masses to consider that they have it, is challenging, because our next message is it's okay, right? And so it begs the question, what is trauma? We went through this period of even considering taking that word out of the documentary completely because it was so loaded, right? Everyone relates to stress and relaying stress in a certain kind of way in life after something stressful has happened, and being different on the other side of that. But trauma does seem to have this, these growing pains around it. So I actually wanted to pass this back to Dr. No to help us answer the question, to define trauma, and perhaps some of the challenges that come with that whole thing.
I just want to touch on something you just said, Jess, which is this thing about us saying that things are supposed to be okay. We live in a society where we're saying that you can do whatever you want to do and be. You just need to work hard enough and believe. And at the same time, we're saying, you know what, it's okay to not be okay. Well, if I'm not okay, that means I haven't done the work to be and do what I want to do. So isn't that my fault? So I think we need to revisit the way that as a culture, we look at our expectations of life, and the way we go through it. To your question about what is trauma, well, like I said, the pathological model always looks as trauma as if it's something bad. And you have multiple different types of trauma. You have adverse childhood experiences. You have trauma such as the threat or the real injury, sexual assault, death of somebody else. So it's all bad stuff. But in reality, good things can be traumatic as well. So if a person has won the lottery, or they become instantly rich and famous, sometimes that can be quite traumatic to them. People who have just left jail after having a long sentence and they have to reintegrate back into society, sometimes they feel overwhelmed by doing it. So if we were to change the definition of trauma as being something that's horrific, that we should avoid at all costs, and anybody who experiences it as being a victim, perhaps if we say that trauma is something that is so different, it's an experience that's so different than from our worldview, that it overwhelms us, then that sort of opens things up to us saying, okay, how can we open our mind to integrate that new experience into us? So I propose that we don't see trauma as good or bad. It's something that just happens, and that we look at it, we turn it in such a way that we say, okay, it's beyond us now. How do we use our resources to integrate it into our being so that we grow?
Great. Thanks, Dr. No. Would anyone like to add to that?
I'll say something on that, Jess.
Sure. Your video's off. You might want it off, just letting you know.
It became very obvious as we filmed this, the semantic debate on these words. And not only the semantics of it, but the relativity of it. Some people don't even have the attributes to realize what is traumatic or isn't traumatic. Not only is it subconscious or unconscious at times, it's just we don't even have the attributes to begin to look at it. And when I think of the word trauma, I like to think of like the physical reality of the universe, moving from entropic states, letting energy flow. And that's not woo-woo, that's called fundamental physics. And sometimes there's energy that comes in from the outside that distorts the potential path of that. And by and large, if we remove kind of a creationist view, which I'm here nor there on, and we look at the evolution of the universe, this is how mutation and adaptation happened. This is how we got stronger, and this is how we complexified until we became us, one of the most complex species in the universe. I do hope there's greater species that are much more complex and can show us new paradigms. But as far as we know, we're up there. You know, this suit of whatever held together by so much information and cellular interaction. So for me, trauma is anything from my DNA, from my ancestral DNA, because I don't really personally, you know, I might get some eye rolls. This is just a belief. I don't believe in junk DNA. I think it stores all kinds of stuff beyond just the epigenetic level. But we could touch on epigenetics. Anytime survival has kicked in and distorted, that's what I start calling trauma. And for humans, for me, anything that distorts you from being your full expression of yourself. And we all know what we mean by that. That thing that sits in here and is like, this is what I would really like to do. This is what I would really like to be. But I have experiences in my life that dictate otherwise. I have childhood patterning that dictate otherwise. I have these reactions that sit well below any consciousness level that dictate that. And to me, trauma is anything that distorts that from happening. But it also is the key to, I think, every single thing that we face as an issue as a species. That's what I personally think. When we were filming this, we looked at, you know, concepts of poverty, of hunger, you name it, deforestation. It doesn't matter where it comes from. They all sit at the root of our fear-based manifestations. And that's the key, right? If we can take those fear-based manifestations and turn them into what I'll just kind of colloquially use as love-based instead, we can look at that as a genetic or hormonal function or a process of thought. But if we can do that, that's where trauma becomes a gift to our species. Thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Jeff. If I can say the last part of what Jeff said in a different way, the thing that has pushed us to put everything we have into this is that laundry list of issues we have on this planet: societal issues, political issues, systemic racism, all those things. And we have humans just like you and me that are making really big decisions, likely with unresolved traumas, that have their own agendas, that go home to families that may be, less than, like, a little bit broken, right? And so we feel if we can heal and become more whole from our difficult experiences, not despite them, the decisions that are made from those kinds of people, and perhaps it's our children, maybe it's too late for us. I say that in jest, but really this is for the kids in a big way. If we want to make long, far-sighted decisions that are going to help their generations, it really takes us to be the most whole we can be. So I wanted to pass this off to Dr. Mike T. Nelson, who has more degrees than anyone should. And Dr. Mike, if you could explain to us a little bit about this physiologic rollover of how doing something with your physical body can affect our psychological well-being.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. There's actually a really good book I'm in the process of reading right now called The Extended Mind. I can't remember the author. I got it around here somewhere. But their whole premise is that we tend to think of everything as sort of a brain neurocentric view a lot of times, but there's a whole bunch of pathways in the body that we're now realizing that to go both directions. So I think it's more of a two-way street. So we're realizing now that there's some interesting feedback from, say, your heart that goes up to your brain that is then interpreted as possibly a feeling of being excited or nervous. Where I think a lot of times historically we've been taught, well, that's just something you thought of in your brain. You had these senses and the feeling was generated only in your brain. So now we're learning that it's very much a two-way street. And I think it was especially related to the conversation about trauma is, at least in my practice, I do some hands-on work related to that many times, while I'm not a psychologist, I'm not trying to treat any of these people from that realm, they have made sometimes some progress in those areas. There's definitely beneficial things that can be done. But I think at some point you also need to address what's actually going on in the physical body at the same time. And once that movement block or whatever is sort of fixed or changed, then a lot of times they have more progress forward. So I think it's actually a quote I got from Doug Heel is that the mind is in the body and the body is in the mind. Like what the other doctor was talking about, we tend to be very siloed in our approach of, okay, this is only neurology and this is only physiology. And we're just learning now that they're both highly interactive with each other. So we would expect that a solution is not going to involve just one, but it's going to involve both the brain and the body.
Thanks, Dr. Mike. I wanted to ask you, since some of the mechanics around what we can do with our bodies sometimes can be more simple than changing our minds or diving into the underworld. Some people just aren't prepared for that with the resources they have or for whatever reason. What are some things that you can share with us that may be fairly simple to do that can increase mental resiliency, psychological flexibility, and things like that?
Yeah, for me, the stuff that has the most research that we've known about for a while is just simple aerobic health. So how well your cardiovascular system is functioning. You can do that by a formal test called the VO2 max test. And we've known for quite a while now that when you're doing aerobic training, for example, your body can secrete something called a compound called BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is kind of like fertilizer for your little neurons, that it helps them work better and grow better. And that's literally by doing a movement-based thing. There's a couple of newer studies showing that strength training may do that. It just hasn't been looked at as much. So something as simple as, you know, aerobic fitness, I think, has a really big role. The other part too is that, in my opinion, doesn't get enough play is just very simple recreation and seeking novel movements. The fact that you can, humans can catch a ball relatively easy, that to me is just an amazing feat of physiology and neurology in order to do that. But because of our jobs and because of our life, we tend to not do and seek those more complex motor tasks, everything from, you know, surfing, I do a lot of kiteboarding, to, you know, tennis, golf, whatever. Just any type of recreation that involves a semi-predictable thing you're trying to do, like tennis, I'm trying to hit the ball across the net, but someone else is hitting it back to me. So it's a little bit chaotic and I have to kind of predict what's going to happen. There's not as much research on that, but I think just moving in novel ways and those helping to kind of reintegrate your brain back into your body. There's a whole bunch of research on there. I'm sure Danielle can talk about too, with related to proprioception and just the perceptions of how you feel. But I like using the example of recreation because it's something most people can do. They have experience doing it. And from a physiology standpoint, it's actually a pretty complex task that humans can do relatively easy. So a joke I've often made is like, okay, try to teach 2 robots to go play tennis, right? That's going to be pretty hard to do, but humans can do those tasks, you know, to varying degrees at a base level relatively easy.
Great, thank you. Dr. D, do you want to add on to that?
Sure, I probably won't speak at the proprioceptive level, but I'll speak at the level in which I imagine this stuff happening, at least from my perspective. The way I imagine this energy just bridging trauma from a physiological perspective to a psychological perspective, physiologically, how I imagine it is I imagine just the way things move around the body in an energetic visual. And so with trauma, things can get stuck and get coagulated and get disorganized. And that starts to block energy flow, kind of like what you were saying, Jeff, with the energy flow being disrupted. And that, at least in depth psychology and Jungian psychology in particular, Carl Jung didn't believe that instinct or physiology was separate from psyche or mind, but just lived on a spectrum and manifested in different ways. And so he had an idea of complexes, which is basically these pockets of energy that coagulate energy and kind of create a vortex, but unconscious complexes can suck your sense of self into the vortex. And so now it's the unconscious instinctual energy or the coagulated energy that is dictating the sense of self and the movement of the sense of self, rather than a co-creative relationship with body and being. And so that's how I feel like body and psyche, body and mind move together. I think about it energetically and stuck pockets of energy. And Rick and I were just talking this morning about the really paradoxical thing about traumatic experience is that somebody who experiences a disruption in their habitual state, let's just say, or a disruption in their sense of self, they can present with very coagulated, overcoupled energy pockets, while at the same time have immense undercoupling too. And so maybe they're only experiencing being as increased heart rate and panic. And what's undercoupled is the resource of feeling settled and relaxed. How can that exist at the same time where things are overcoupled and undercoupled? And so working with trauma from a body psyche level is about kind of playing in that paradoxical space, moving with those things that have gotten stuck and have gotten coagulated together, but then also being the guardrails for the system so that things that have gotten lost and undercoupled and are floating out in the middle of nowhere psyche being can spontaneously return. And so instead of us operating our sense of self out of an axis of survival, there's a deeper reciprocity and spontaneity of being. When we can release that stuck energy, we can actually move with a little bit more flexibility. And so that's how I see that bridge existing.
Jess, I would love a chance to just quickly add on to that if that's
Yeah,
all
please
right.
do.
So I've never really presented this as a whole thought. So here it goes, and bear with me. We introduced the concept of intentionally facilitated post-traumatic growth in the documentary. We're running the last serial of the process because of this documentary. We didn't feel it was fully in our ethos, and for a few other reasons, we are evolving the course, but that's here nor there. One of the things we began doing is measuring on a David Hawkins scale people's level of consciousness. And we do this as blind as possible with as much control as possible with like the human body. A lot of people might, kind of shrug at applied kinesiology and, emotional recall, those kinds of things. But in essence, it's testing the strengths of your nervous system. And we started to see very early on that those with the strongest tests were the ones who made it through the event. And with that, there's some correlations there. If we look at their lives as a whole, because one of the things of the program is we comb through their lives in as much detail as we can, from their blood all the way up into as much of their interactions with other people as we can. And all the things that like equate to high flourishing, on GAD-9s, PHQs, those kinds of tests in the medical world, high consciousness scales out of Scandinavia, they all have correlations to those. And what we found is those who were walking around with unresolved trauma the most scored lower, and they were not able to make it through. So that's not to say that those that had the higher consciousness, those with the higher consciousness scores, I'm just calling it higher consciousness scores, which look like usually a bit of a higher intellect, higher intelligence, the ability to move their body holistically. Think of like a healthy physiological body, not necessarily, super athlete or super mathlete or whatever, but like a really well-balanced approach to the human being. And they all went through trauma. Because we all do. They just went through it and cycled through it more and experienced more, and they were able to develop this resilience. It makes total sense, but it also equated to better relationships, the ability to work on a team better, all kinds of these little factors. And we're excited this year to introduce HRV to that mix and see what comes up with that. And we'll continue to explore, but I just wanted to mention that. Thanks, Jess.
Great. Thank you,
Jess, can I add 30 seconds to that?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, awesome. With what Dr. Mike and Dr. Danielle were talking about, it's really interesting seeing their perspective of things, because from a resilience standpoint, when a person becomes traumatized, they don't feel safe within their own bodies. Now, an event that might be triggered in their intellect will stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, which will create the endocrine system to make changes in the body, such as respiration, heart rate, muscle tension, things like that. And people who are not used to that sort of sensation in their body will feel very, very uncomfortable and try to dissociate. Exercise, especially aerobic exercise, where it's consistent and it's predictable, it will give us a sense of regularity, and it will give us a sense of control. Because when I'm exercising, when I'm physically moving my body, I'm externalizing a lot of my stresses, and I'm able to regulate my muscle activity. I'm able to regulate my heart rate and my breathing. That allows me to feel safer in my body and to reconnect with myself. So in resilience research, control and predictability are two very, very important factors that allow a person to either recover or to not get into a dysfunction in the first place.
Great, thank you. All right, so to close us out, I did want to address one really important issue, more or less, that we have come across and we feel needs to be talked about, which is the controversy of something like this, of post-traumatic growth. The controversy, one being creating a film where the antagonist is yourself. the controversy number 2 that I'd really like to speak to, and I'd like to pass this over to Rick to close us out, is what would you imagine are some of the misconceptions around post-traumatic growth and what we're presenting here? How might it be different than what can be considered the go hard or go home culture that also exists out there?
Yeah, let's do that in 30 seconds. I feel I feel like I think that we are so desperate to find solutions to the things that we struggle with, and that when really simple solutions are offered to us, they feel very salient to us, and so we grab onto them. I've noticed this a lot because I was in the ultra endurance community before, while I was in the military, and so I've kind of been around a lot of this idea of go hard or go home. And here's another thing that's very interesting about the process that I notice is we put these people through the process, and most people don't make it. And what I noticed in interviewing people that didn't make it is that all of them had role models of people who had the go hard or go home mentality. And those were the people that they most listened to. And so what you start to discover is that if going hard is your only gear, there's a time where that's the case, where you do kind of got to like put your head down and go after what you want, or to push through something difficult. Like, I certainly understand the value of that. But if it's the only gear that you have, and you hit a point in your life where it stops working, you're out of options. You're out of opportunity. There's no more nuance. And so something I've said often is that, one of the most famous Winston Churchill quote, I think it's Churchill, is when you're going through hell, keep going. And I always say, no, stop, look around, find out what landed you in hell so that you don't hit the roundabout on your way out and end up back here in 2 years, And so there's an idea that we have to build more of an understanding about what's happening to us when we're going through these things, and what's available to us while we're going through them. What other gears do we have? Perhaps surrender is actually what we need. And if we're stuck, putting the throttle down, when really what we need is surrender, or the Stoic idea of amor fati, which is like the love of one's fate. Perhaps that's what we need in this moment. But if the only thing we have is go hard or go home, then we're inevitably, life is going to run us into a circumstance at which that no longer works, and we're going to be out of options. And then, the second part is that this is an interesting thing to admit, but I actually struggle with the idea of growth, the idea of post-traumatic growth. I almost think about it more like a post-traumatic deepening. A deepening into what it means to be you, a deepening into your life. Because, Jeff talked about this idea that, and this is something we talk about in the film, is that growth, for most of us, is this linear progress. And then if we hit a point where all of a sudden we're not moving in a linear progress, which is usually gone by our mood, whether we're actually progressing or not. But so we have this idea of linear progress. And then what happens is that the soul brings us back around to face something that is unresolved. And all of a sudden we feel like we're failing because we're not growing. But the truth is, we could be deepening. We could be learning something deeper about what it means to be us. And so Jeff brought up this idea of, really, I think what we want is to be the full expression of who we are. If that's what's on offer for us anyway. And so what's interesting about that is that I have a PTSD diagnosis, and there's this idea that most people don't run. I got that from the military, but most people don't run toward trauma unless they're running from trauma, right? Or toward chaos unless they're running from chaos. And so we could very easily consider all of these bad things, except for the fact that it's made me really interested in my life, interested in why I react in certain ways, interested in why I have particular patterns. And as that interest starts to deepen, and I start to reflect, and I start to chew on that and contemplate that, I start to get a deeper understanding about who I am and what I want to bring to the world. And now all of a sudden I'm writing a script and a documentary about trauma, and that's the full expression of who I am. But notice that that expression wouldn't be possible had I not gone through difficult things that made me interested in contemplating them in the first place. So again, it's the misconception, I think, is that something bad happens and the only value that that bad thing happening gives to us is to get to the other side of it where bad things are no longer happening. And I'm saying, no, I think that there's value in the thing itself happening. I think it reveals something to you about who you are, about what it means to be a human in the world, about what it means to accept the limits of being a human. And soul is made in the process of bearing that, of being with that, of suffering through that. You start to realize when somebody is taken from you, you immediately realize how many moments you took for granted, right? You immediately understand that. And so I think that these things happening aren't so that something better can happen later. I think that's a fantasy that a lot of people have. But what I'm saying is that bad things or difficult things happen to us. And when they do, we can deepen our understanding about what it means to be us. And if we're really listening, in those fracturing moments, that's where wisdom is made. You know, wisdom is earned by bearing what it means to be human. So I would say I would start with that.
Thank you so much. All right, as we close this out, I just wanted to point out that we want this to be the quintessential film for trauma as these growing pains around being trauma informed start to dissipate and we evolve the conversation. And to point out that the people that you've heard from today don't come from a silver spoon background, more or less. Like Rick has shared a bit of his story. Jeff fell out of a helicopter and hit a car on the way down, amongst many things. Dr. No is a Vietnamese boat refugee. Dr. Mike can only see in 2D. Like, really, we're all pieces of paper to him. And that is actually like quite a lot to work with. So just to highlight what Rick was saying there, we really do believe that everyone's mess becomes a message. And that's why this message for us is so important. And so if you can spread this link, the Kickstarter link, to as many people as you can. It's less about the money at this point, if I'm fairly honest with you, and more about the amount of backers, because this will give us the opportunity to take it to distributors and streamers to show them that people really do care about resolving some of the issues that maybe are swept under the rug these days for more remarkable news headlines. So thank you all so much for joining. Woo! 30 minutes right on the mark there. Thank you so much. And I'll be sending that survey in the next day or so. Y'all have a great day.
Thanks, Jess.